Well, here we are, another episode. Renee,
And
what are we going to talk about today?
well, today we're going to talk about the process of civil commitment. And civil commitment is a big issue all around the Midwest. It might be through the entire country, but most of the work that we've been working in, thinking about like how those laws work, how do you get there, what's going on, and then ways that that can improve. We're going to be talking about the grades of various states that we're working in and kind of, what the policy recommendations are. But before we get started, so Jason, what in the world is happening in the farming community today?
Well, that's the problem, nothing. We're waiting for the crop to grow. And so when there's idle time on my hands and like I'm working and I'm avoiding doing reports, sometimes I kind of meander over to those auction sites. And like there'll be a good deal and I'll be bidding on something because I'm bidding online. And it's like it's close. It's like, oh, that one's just 30 miles away. If I won something, I could just stop by and pick it up. But inevitably, the thing I'm bidding on, I don't win. But I win that other stuff, like the things I really don't need, but I was bidding on it because it was a good deal. And so the other day I had to drive 40 miles to pick up a couple bottle jacks I got for $5, which was a great deal. And they worked, but I shouldn't be bidding on those things. So I need someone to keep me from bidding. It's a bit addictive. It's kind of like gambling because you're thinking you're going to get a good deal. And it's that auction mentality, right? You just want to keep going and you kind of get into the flow of, well, that guy's not going to outbid me. Click, click. So
Whoops.
don't let me bid. Don't let me bid at auctions. It's kind of that old thing of hold my arms down in an auction. Put me in handcuffs when I go to an auction because you do get into the mentality and you just want to keep going. I don't know if you're an auction person,
I'm
Renee.
not. I'm not. I'm really well, it's kind of funny. I guess if I were naturally just me, I'd probably have a lot more crap in my house because I've met around all my family. I legit come from that collection, keep stuff. But I married Brent and it'll be 30 years this summer. And let me just tell you, Brent is a no nonsense. We're not having garbage in the house, non-clutter kind of guy. And so he's one actually. So are you kidding me? Me at an auction, I'd be in so much trouble. So and luckily they don't auction. Well, maybe they do, but I haven't ever found out that things that I actually would collect or be part of. So no, I don't do the auction thing, but it does sound like a good idea to keep you away from them this time of year. So
Yes.
to kick this off, we're talking about commitment laws, and we're doing this because we live in the state of Iowa and know those laws pretty well. And I work currently with criminal justice all the time, and we've got some issues in our own state being brought in front of the Supreme Court and different issues that I'll just sort of talk about some today. But then you're been working in North Dakota, been working in Nebraska, and other neighboring states. And so we just want to talk about how they're different. And to kick it off, no two states are the same. So this is another one of those topics that there's not going to be like a way to do it. There may be a best practice, there might be, but everybody's different. So where do you want to
And
start with this
it's
conversation?
Well, it's complicated. This is a great example of families and loved ones when they're experiencing a mental health crisis or they're going through a horrible component of their disease, that these laws are very difficult to interpret sometimes. Sometimes they actually don't do what they're intended to do. And so there's frustration of all parties. And so I think we just start the conversation saying we're going to try to talk about something that's really hard to talk about
Yeah.
because these are not simple things to try to understand. I've been in Iowa, 20, 25 years now working in the field. And it's complicated to try to explain it to a family here. And as I go to other states and try to learn what their system is, and sometimes it's very different than our system here, trying to understand it, interpret it, it's a challenge.
Right. So let's maybe stop and start backwards a little bit. But why would anybody ever need to be civilly committed? And what is that process for? And what's the value of it in the first place? Because every state has it and it's an option for folks that need from the mental health and the substance use perspective. But really, what's the purpose of it? Why do we have this civil commitment process?
It's a good question. And I think we just go with a high level, right? I mean, the civil commitment is there to keep someone safe.
Mhm.
When someone's experiencing in the throes of their mental health or addiction and they need someplace to be short term to stabilize. And I think that's the hard part is it's intended to be only when that person it doesn't have the capacity to make decisions for themselves. Renee, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that people, maybe you're not finding the bed that you need, you're not finding the supports that you need. And maybe the person doesn't even realize how sick they are. And I'm trying to think of that term that Leslie taught us a little while back. And then the term's escaping me because it's a hard word for me to say. But basically, that's where you're so sick, you don't even realize you're sick. So you could be in an active psychosis and believing you're somebody that you're not. So that they need help to get you help, but you don't even realize you need help, right? And so sometimes you land in that case of just struggling to get somebody the supports they need. So we do have a law enforcement route through the judicial system in every state that can get you kind of bumped to the front of the line to get you held. And the idea is in most places, you're held for 48 to 72 hours with getting a psychological evaluation to know then if you need to be moved into a facility or just released or what. So it's kind of like that hold, if you will. You're going to put into a hold state so that you're safe for that 48 to 72, bumps you to the front of the line, get a psych eval, and then figure out what to do with you on the back end. Except that's where the gap falls, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So what have we seen around the states that we're working in, kind of how these processes work?
Well, we're going to reference a couple of articles. And so one article I'm kind of looking at as we have this conversation is something that's put out by the Treatment Advocacy Center. And so they actually gave a letter grade to states. And so I'm going to kind of put it out there like this, because I'm just going to take their letter grades. So we're going to be talking today about North Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska, just because we happen to know a little bit more about their internal systems. And the grades in those three states range from A minus to D, right? So we've seen the variability and the variation across all of those states being very different. One's an A minus, Iowa's a B minus, Nebraska's a D. And I think that kind of summarizes what we've seen, right? And even in the state that's rated in this really well, we've seen issues where it didn't work at all in certain
No.
situations. And so, I think it's always good when we can kind of see an analysis done that helps us to kind of articulate some of the issues that can happen, especially when there's so much variability across the states.
Right. So in the state of Iowa, just as the one example of how it works, two adults can make a request for somebody to get civilly committed, and it goes through our magistrate process. So the magistrate in the various offices are the folks that have to make that call. And we in our office just brought on a magistrate that was her specialty. We really should have her on at some point as an interview to talk about how it really works, getting the nitty gritty in Iowa. But there's a judge that makes a decision on whether or not the person should be held or not. And it's based on testimony. It's based on, bringing in documentation, showing the need, that kind of thing. And then they're held typically in a psychiatric hospital setting, but involuntarily. So the person then has lost, that's what the commitment portion is about. You no longer can voluntarily walk away. You're civilly committed or kept against your will, if you will. That didn't make sense, but against your will. And so it's not, you don't no longer just get to walk off. You're now, the court has ordered you for this place to be for that time period. So that's what we're looking at here. And in Iowa, takes two adults as the process to move through. So and it looks the same way pretty much in North Dakota. It's two adults as well, where an 18-year-old or older can with another person. And then in North Dakota, it has to be another attorney. It has to be a special type of attorney who has seen the person. And then they also have to have that statement that's a current statement within so many days of their mental health professional saying that they need those services, or a substance abuse counselor could also do the same. So they have to have the piece of paper along with an attorney. So in North Dakota, it's not just two people. There has to be a legal component to it as well. I think I was a little more loose on that, which is probably why we have the lower grade.
Yeah, and Nebraska, there's actually a board. Each different area has a board that comes together that includes a mental health professional. And so, it seems a little clunkier because there's a lot of people, right? There's like 160 of these board members across the state that have to be trained, and then they're located in each different region. And so, you start to understand the variability in navigating these systems. And then also the different ways that the laws are written and the different criteria that exist when it comes to defining dangerousness or using terms like imminent, which is really recommended to be taken out of legislation at this point because it's created a disconnect from what happens.
So I'm thinking about like the analysis part, like what are some of the things that kind of went in to why they like them or don't like them? Do we know kind of what some of those things are? I think some of the recommendations for why the grading is the way it is might be interesting to our listeners about what are some of those criteria or policy recommendations that move you to the top of the line. And by the way, just who's the best at this when we're talking about states? Was there a state that really does the best according to everybody on the list?
Well, you're asking questions and making me scroll around
You
because I
don't
wasn't
know the answers
expecting
to the
that
questions?
at all. Minnesota actually gets an A+ when it comes to this, as does West Virginia is a solid A. And so Wisconsin does pretty well, Michigan, West Virginia. I think, as we look across the country, right, there were 10 states with an A and
Mm,
8 states with an F. And so you just
mm,
have this range of how these laws have evolved. And that goes to how different each state functions when it comes to these things. However, we know a lot as a science in behavioral health. And so,
mm.
I think what's concerning to me is as best practice has evolved and as we've learned more, some of these laws are 30 or 40 years old, right? And when they were created and they've been cleaned up a little bit, but you can only do so much to clean up legislation, Renee.
Yeah.
And if it's an older law and it's tried to be amended, once it's amended too many times, then it just loses something. And so that's where we really then see this variability.
Yeah. And it looks like with this analysis that we're referencing that's in the show notes, there's several states with there's no path at all to civil commitment for those who can't meet their basic needs due to mental illness. So that gets you in the F category. You have zero path to get to there. So there's no legal remedy for somebody with mental health issues. Then there's also 3 states with no law allowing civil commitment to occur on an outpatient basis. So they don't like that you only have a civil commitment only to a locked facility rather than an outpatient option. So that gets you a lower score. And then finally, one that the law was written to prevent, there was an AOT law is one that was written to prevent its use as an alternative to hospitalization. So AOT being that assisted outpatient treatment, they don't even have it available as an alternative to the hospital. And so those get you those lower scores. So to get better scores, you need to have more options available, a cleaner path through the legal system that people can actually follow through, and then be able to actually use assisted outpatient type treatments and or have an outpatient option. Because if you think about that, that all ties back to the laws at the federal level where we're supposed to give people choice, right? And so people, even when their rights are removed from them, they still are supposed to have a choice, if possible, in their care and how they're taken care of. And so to only have facility only choices, you're sticking people in a facility maybe against their will. And didn't you just send me an article about people in a different state that we're not talking about currently that were sticking everybody into nursing homes for
I
mental health
did.
treatment? And they were
I
using
did.
civil commitment to stick them in nursing homes, right? And
That's
I'm sure that
correct.
probably not a good score either. I
Yeah,
haven't looked, but I'm thinking that's not good.
and I think we're starting to see how complicated this issue is. So I think to boil it down just for a minute, just remember we're talking about 3 specific components, right? There's a psychiatric evaluation, there's inpatient commitment, and then there's outpatient commitment. And when we talk about that AOT, that's a relatively new term, right? That's not something that we really embraced and talked about really over the last, I can say, in my career, that's only something that we've more recently started talking about. And traditionally, when I look at our system now, especially kind of from the 10,000-foot level, that's the part that's been missing. That's the ongoing treatment and stabilization that really helps someone. The focus so oftentimes is on that inpatient commitment piece, the inpatient piece. When we go to state hospitals, when we're working with institutions, the focus is on beds and
Right.
inpatient, when really we should be focusing on community and community support, right? And really that a lot of times we serve with that outpatient commitment piece. that hasn't necessarily been embraced in a lot of areas or embraced by the courts.
Right. And that assisted outpatient treatment, the other issue that we have in many of the states is they have to fail so many times at so many levels of care before it's even available to them as an option, that, somebody's had to just have a very miserable situation for a very long time, failing and flunking out of all different other types of treatments before they'll option it. And so it's not a good solution when it has to be the very last ditch option rather than letting people utilize it sooner. And there really is a legal argument for assisted outpatient treatment. We have some in our state. When we brought Leslie Carpenter came on and talked with us in an interview, and we can now give it to people who don't really understand that they're sick as part of an outpatient option for them in parts of our state. But that's a real ethical dilemma for states and for people to think about, because if the person doesn't know they're sick and they think that they're fine, forcing them to take medication, there are people out there that fight that that's against their will and that's against their civil rights as a person. And so the argument on the treatment side is, but they don't even know they're sick. And so we're just leaving them to often be homeless or often to be in the criminal justice system. And so this is a hard topic because you're wanting to help people who are so sick they don't know they're sick. And yet, some people are saying, hey, but they have rights too. And so that gets really sticky.
On the flip side, you have some folks who are now stabilized in institutions that need additional oversight and care. And AOT can also be an option to free up beds and serve people in community-based care. And so I think that the alternative side is there's also a group of people who really fit well, but they need that added support and oversight. And sometimes oversight of the courts can be very effective. And so I think that's the challenge we're seeing play out across states in being hesitant to embrace AOT or not sure how to screen and get the right people using, in those types of care.
And I don't know that we have that option in our state, but it would be, I can tell you how many times I see it could be super helpful. But when we have people re-entering from prison, oftentimes the folks, if they've gotten on the right medications, are some of the most stable at the time of release from prison, at least in our state, because we have really great medical care in there for them, can get them stabilized. But if there's no AOT on the outside for them to get connected to, and they can't get their medications or can't figure out how to administer them regularly, they end up right back into that same system. And often then once you're on parole, and often once you're still being monitored by the court, it's a very quick turnaround for recidivism. And then they're right back in prison again. And because there's that fall off, like you're talking about, where they can't, once they're stable, they can't maintain stability because there isn't that piece to hold them accountable to staying on their medication. And that's really unfortunate, because in the prisons in our state and jails and other states end up being the stabilizing location for folks where they get the longer term care and help to be stable, but they're incarcerated for that stability. And then once they're let out, there's no level of support enough to help them stay stable.
And I think I would call that a treatment failure. I really see that as a provider engagement failure, as opposed to that individual not seeking the treatment they should have. Really, that's a treatment 100%. Provider responsibility. And the legal system should be involved in ensuring that the treatment provider carries that out. And I think that's where our systems has failed us. We talk about systems. There's a great example of the healthcare system not meeting the needs, the high level of needs that person needs coming out of that jail and prison. And so, AOT can be the means of bringing everyone together to do that if developed and put together correctly. Our systems and structures haven't come along to be able to do that to this point.
No. And I've met a person, at least one, if not several, who during the pandemic, when things shut down, they were stable, they were on their medications, they were doing well. But when the facilities shut down and they couldn't get their medications, things started happening and they ended up in prison and then sat either in some states for a very long time because even the courts shut down, or, without charged with things, or ended up getting revoked back to prison. And then you find out it was just simply because, like you said, it was a failure. And that part I wouldn't hold people accountable necessarily to if they couldn't be open during the pandemic. But that happens way more than people want to talk about, that they can't get the medications they need on the outside. And then there's another big piece that we're still working on in our state, and that's Medicaid eligibility. You don't have Medicaid eligibility incarcerated, and we in our state don't have it available when they're in the work release site, which is still under supervision, but out of the facilities, but in a place where it's more structured. We still can't get Medicaid in our state. Other states can. You can actually change the your plan with the federal government to get monies at that level, and we don't in our state. So I'm having conversations about the why, because I just want to know.
Eight states were just approved to provide Medicaid 90 days pre-release.
See,
So
we don't have
Medicaid
any of
is,
that in our state, and it hurts my
yep,
heart because there's a gap there because they have to get back on their insurance, which is what they use for
right.
insurance. And of course they lapse on their medications.
Yep.
And so we don't have that. And so I'm having a conversation. I didn't even know it was available within the incarceration, because we have a problem there. But then when I release them to that next level in our districts, they would be a district and they're released, they can't get Social Security in their Social Security there. They can't get Medicaid. Some of them can get Medicare, but it's really ridiculous when other states can. Another lapse for us in that same space is we have people that are long-term in that sexual offenses where they've been maybe violent or considered a sexual predator. We really struggle because we are limited on housing options, but the treatment gap, they lose their medications along that path too.
Mm-hmm.
And so we end up with folks who get back and, they cause another issue or a violation or whatever and end up reincarcerated. And it was a failure of treatment. It wasn't about them committing new crimes. And those are considered technical violations, which we try to keep really low. But you've got people, once they're back, not stable again, they get violent quickly, or people find them threatening, and so then they're right back. And it's really a hard space to manage. So are there some recommendations for states about how we can improve this system that in this report that we've been talking about?
I was just thinking that because we've just talked about a lot of stuff. And,
Yeah,
I think that's where, this report does a really nice job of kind of highlighting then what should we be advocating for, in our states, how can we advocate for continuity really across the country, right? Because I think everyone in the United States should have access to appropriate care and appropriate aftercare, right? It's not just about that initial evaluation, keeping someone safe, decreasing suicide is always the number one goal. So generally it's danger to self, it could be others. But then looking at that AOT, how do we continue care? And that seems to be the biggest challenge, right? And so it's not just about emergency holds, but making sure that emergency holds aren't less than 72 hours. Some states still only have a 24-hour hold, which isn't enough time. Sometimes you're barely seeing a psychiatrist once.
Right.
And so, at least giving someone the opportunity to start to clear their head, so that they can be engaged in that ongoing treatment, being clear to practitioners, families, hospitals. The laws need to be clear, and there needs to be clear guidance. And that's very challenging. Even when we're just trying to get a snapshot, when we're going to a state to do a presentation on something, and somebody asks us a question, I always kind of try to know what are some of the topics that I know are going to come up. And it's really hard. I know what I'm looking for when I'm reading for it. And sometimes it's really hard to interpret other states' stuff. Thinking about how do family members engage the system? Is it easy for those family members to be able to do that? All of those things need to be taken into consideration, as well as the person's history. A lot of times you can only take into account what the person's done currently. They don't allow you to take into account the person's prior mental health history, the person's prior behavioral history. And so it's important to look back a little bit. I'm not saying we should hold things against people forever, but let's look at their previous diagnosis, their previous behavior. That should all be taken into consideration. Don't you think that's just reasonable, Renee?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about all of this too. And one of the challenges is that limitation of only being imminent harm to self or others leaves out that large group we've been talking about of people who are seriously and persistently mentally ill, that, they may not be a grave danger today, but not being able to get the medication help that they need is going to then cause trouble. So, there are some people thinking that even that criteria is a little bit too narrow. So it's leaving out some of the folks that are struggling the most, that need the medications. And that's it's a big topic, but I think you can really see that there could be value there for for that. And then, you're right immediately about making sure you bring in that's where the history comes in, right? Because again, if AOT is only available after you've failed all of these times, every time they get stable, they pull it away. And that was what was keeping them stable. And so then you just start the whole cycle over again. And
Right.
it's so frustrating for people to not be able to use that system.
And that's really the remainder of the recommendations in this report are really around AOT and how do we better utilize and leverage AOT? How do we use AOT instead of some of the other more intrusive options as being a way of helping people almost, more as a diversion as opposed to the continued failures, right? How do we use AOT and leverage that and make sure that providers and others understand what AOT is and working alongside the court system to make that happen?
Yeah.
That partnership isn't happening in most states
Right.
today.
So as we're talking about this, I want to touch on a couple of challenges we're facing in a couple of different states. And one of the challenges in our state, in Iowa, there is a civil commitment process for folks that have been incarcerated for sexual predator type behavior or violent behavior. And there's a commitment process that goes through the Attorney General's office that is supposed to review them to determine if they're civilly committed or if they can be released to the community. And it's a pretty strict criteria. You have got to be it's not just any sex offense by any means. It's the worst of the worst that have done repeatedly terrible things. And so they get into this list, but the challenge we're having in our state is how long it takes them to get reviewed by the Attorney General's office. And they get put into this kind of a waiting queue. And so they're not then considered for parole, which makes sense. If you're in the process of being civilly committed, the parole board can't just let you go. But it, in their minds, takes too long. So there's always legal action being done and discussion about that. The state has cited on the side of the Attorney General several times saying that, yeah, you're in the queue and we're going to get to you as soon as we can, but it doesn't mean that you could just be let free. But there are some times that's a legal struggle. So we do always have, especially around this topic is not one that is stagnant with civil commitment, same with assisted outpatient treatment. It's a constant legal conversation because as we learn more scientifically about these folks, we're having to go back and look at our laws and see if we're actually supporting people or not supporting people. At the same time, while making sure they have their rights maintained if they can. And so it's a real true legal battle of rights, not taking rights away from people who should have their rights, but at the same time helping those who may not be able to help themselves. And so it gets really complicated and sticky. So it's not an easy topic. And I know I've heard from families who just want this to be a simple solution that they can just commit somebody and get them into the hospital care because maybe it's too hard to find that open bed. But this process is difficult by design, and it should be, because you're talking about removing the rights of an individual and deciding at what point are they so sick they can't make their own decisions. And that's a hard job. I'm glad that's not my job. But that's where we are in Iowa. So Jason, do you want to talk about maybe a challenge or two in North Nebraska or North Dakota that you've run into?
Well, I mean, we've run into this as it crosses over into the number of beds that they need, So
Yeah.
we look at state hospitals and institutions.
Yeah.
This is a conversation that's first and foremost when we start talking about how many beds do we need? How many beds do we need in each category? Why can't we serve more people? And it's always this throughput issue, right? Is because we have a number of folks who are under commitment. And then we don't know what happens next, right?
Right.
And so folks get stuck in that, and kind of just with that label. And
Yep.
then, especially we saw during COVID, the system stopped.
Yes.
And, amazingly, I just saw the press release, we're working in Nebraska. And of course, I saw the press release. Nobody told me about it. But suddenly they've worked through their waiting list, right? Well, it's been a waiting list since COVID. And so they just now got all their systems and structures back in line where the throughput is happening. Right. But it took years to do that because
good,
the systems. Yeah. Right.
The fact that your eyes are on it and that this legislature wanted to prioritize that is what helped move that forward. So to take pride in that, because it's the work that you're doing, shining a light on it, that they're like, hey, it really has been 4 years. We should clean this up. But,
right. And so it's, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so there we are, the squeaky wheel. And suddenly, so now I don't know what we're writing the report about because it suddenly fixed the whole issue. So that makes the
Oh,
recommendations a little easier,
that
I
that
guess.
reminds me something you said before about policy versus the way things actually work on the ground. This is a great place to put this. But you were talking about knowing how the policy works in a new state, right? And we all know that the law, what it says on the books, is definitely not the way it's
Right.
actually implemented. And so that's where it gets the real rubber hits the road. And the tricky part is like there's nuances to how the system works that is hard to actually always see, because you'll read it and go, is this what it says? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, but this isn't how it works. And so you just landed exactly right in that, right? So now the press release says it's done, but is it really? And now
Right.
you're going to have to now get on the ground and be like, where did they move them to? What other list did they move them
Right.
to? And where did they go? And all of those kind of questions, because you're like, you want to believe that. But when it comes to policy, sometimes you go back and go, huh? And like, well, it says that this is how you get somebody placed. And then you get into it and they're like, not exactly. We only do this kind
Right.
of person or that kind of person. And that's, again, what we always talk about, where people make more limits to the law than are actually
Well,
written there.
and to those challenges, then we also see it's done different regionally, right?
Oh
Different
gosh, yes.
regions do
Oh
completely
yes.
different things, and where people are placed. I think the most concerning for me is depending on where you live, you might go to a hospital or you
Yes.
might go to like a crisis residential. And in the law, it says it's two different levels of care, but they're being treated as the same. And they're
Right.
absolutely not the same
Well, and the
in
one
what you
state that,
receive and how you're
yeah.
stabilized. And so it's concerning that folks, depending on where you live, are going to get a different type of care, even though the law says it's all the same, right? And I think that's the concerning part.
Well, and the state that you were working in that came up with those locked 16-bed whatever's
Right.
where they commit people to them and they're stuck in them, or
Locked
that state,
residential treatment units. And so, yeah, I mean, and
which
so
isn't even
what
a
level of
thing.
care is that? Right. And so
Right.
they
It's
created
not
their
a
own
thing.
level of care. It's not defined. And so that then it's being treated the same as an acute care hospital, which shouldn't be
Right.
the same thing at
Or
all.
the state we talked about where they use the nursing homes for the same thing,
Right.
lock people into those, and they're not even nursing home
Right.
ages. And well,
Right.
when we worked in a state where they weren't even, the geriatric unit had nothing to do with your age at all. It
No.
was just whoever they shoved there. And so
Right.
this clearly is an issue that's a problem across the whole country. And so, I mean, takeaways from today, it's not just us, it's everybody struggling, and we're all doing different things. But really, when you're thinking about the rights and the ability of people with serious mental illness to get the treatment they need, this gets difficult because it's not the same, it's not always equitable, it's not always fair, and it's not always necessarily best practice. And so it gets rough for families to be like, I don't understand it, this is too hard. Yeah, you're right. And so we're not going to say that you should understand it, because it isn't an easy system to get. It's hard. It's there supposedly as a tool for us to use, but can it be overutilized or underutilized? Absolutely. And it doesn't always look the way we want it to.
And it's not always seems like it's related, but in the next podcast, we're going to dive into competency restoration. And that's not something we talk a lot about in behavioral health. It's a very specific thing that generally states have to carry out on their own, but it's very impactful, right? When we look at the jails, law enforcement, and this crossover of this behavioral health of individuals who are experiencing behavioral health conditions, it's really an important aspect we have to take into account, because those areas are serving more people than they ever have historically. We see a lot more individuals being referred to competency restoration. The charts are through the books. And so we need to pause and take a look at that data and kind of ask ourselves, what's going on? What's going on in our criminal justice system? What's happening in our jails and prisons? And what's going on in our communities that's really
Yeah,
causing this spike to occur today?
agreed. Well, today, the recovering politician self-care policy of the week. Do you know what time it is, Jason? It's one of my favorite times of the year. I know I say that a lot, but this is really one of my favorite times of the year. It is the
What
Iowa State Fair. Are you
I
kidding
just
me?
looked up. I just looked up to see what you wrote that you were going to talk about. It made me laugh. What happens at the Iowa State Fair
Oh
every
my
year, Renee?
gosh, I love the Iowa State Fair. And what's so funny about that is there are people that are fair people and people that are not fair people. I'm telling you what, my husband and I, we are fair people. We will go as many days as we can allow with work and whatever. I may even have taken days off just so I can hang out at the fair. But my favorite thing at the fair, and this is because I'm an 80s girl through and through. I was all about the metal hair bands in the 80s. Hairball. People, if you don't understand hairball, we're just not friends. But I'm telling you what, Jason came with us last year. We have to do it again this year. But 2 nights on the free stage, thousands and thousands of people sing all the tunes we all know, love, and maybe you love to hate from the 80s that you can't forget because you know all the words. And it is the most fun. And I get so excited every year. They have two days this year. So it's coming up and this is the week. So I don't know. I know a lot of my other friends really love the state fair because they had kids that did all the 4-H stuff and did all the ag stuff. And I've gotten some behind the scene tours from my amazing friends that are farmers that have helped me see the rest of the fair. But I'm telling you what, I just have a great old time all by myself. I get my annual corn dog. Dang.
I'm looking at my calendar right now, and Hairball is on my calendar because there's only one evening I'm available to go. I will warn you, Brent and I have to work during the day, and so it's going to be an evening only at the fair. Renee, I'm sorry, but we have to work.
You're
We have
gonna have to
projects.
reschedule things. You need to get your priorities in order. That's just messed up. So
Well, I
anyway,
guess
everybody, it is that time of year. So if you're wherever you are, enjoy the state fair because that's the bomb. So that's part of my self-care plan for this week. Today we talked about a different topic we don't normally talk about, but civil commitment. And it crashes right into our folks that have mental health and substance use needs. And we talked about how it's really a challenging system. We have linked for you the 3 states we talked about today, how their specific processes should work, and should being the operative term because it doesn't always work the way we think it does, but the way it should work. And then we talked about some of the challenges we've seen across the state. The next time we're going to be chatting about the issue with competency to stand trial, which is tied and linked into this. So we'll see you then, everybody. Have a great week.